The steam rose from the industrial-sized pots as Sarah Martinez ladled another serving of beef stew onto the metal tray. The mess hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of soldiers eating, talking, and briefly forgetting they were thousands of miles from home. She moved with practiced efficiency behind the serving counter, her blonde hair pulled back in regulation style, her uniform crisp despite the heat from the kitchen. To anyone watching, she looked like just another support staff member doing her job. The soldiers filing past her saw a pretty face serving their meals, maybe exchanged a few friendly words about the food or the weather back home. They had no idea that the woman handing them mashed potatoes had spent 3 years in the most grueling military training program in the world. Sarah had earned her SEAL Trident the hard way. She was among the first women to complete the brutal basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, enduring months of physical and mental torture that broke men twice her size. She could infiltrate enemy territory, neutralize targets with deadly precision, and survive in hostile environments that would kill most people within hours. But, right now, she was serving lunch to hungry soldiers at Forward Operating Base Crimson in Afghanistan. The assignment had come down through channels 3 months ago. The Navy needed experienced operators in support roles throughout the theater, and Sarah had drawn mess hall duty. Some of her former teammates had questioned the decision, wondering why they would waste a SEAL on kitchen work. But Sarah understood the bigger picture. Every position on a forward operating base was critical, and sometimes the most important missions came disguised as routine assignments. She had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father ran a diner and her mother worked as a nurse. The combination of service and hard work was bred into her bones. When she joined the Navy at 18, she had no intention of becoming a SEAL. That dream seemed impossible for a woman. But as opportunities opened and barriers fell, she found herself driven to test her limits against the most challenging program the military had to offer. The Hell Week alone nearly broke her. 5 days of constant physical activity, sleep deprivation, and mental pressure designed to weed out all but the most determined candidates. She remembered lying in the mud at 3 a.m., so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, while instructors screamed at her to keep moving. Every muscle in her body screamed in agony. Her hands were raw from rope climbs, and her feet were bleeding inside her boots. But she had a secret weapon that many of her male counterparts lacked. Growing up as the smallest kid on her high school football team, she had learned that technique and determination could overcome raw strength. When the bigger candidates tried to muscle their way through obstacles, she used leverage and intelligence. When they relied on brute force during combat training, she employed speed and precision. The psychological evaluations were perhaps even more challenging than the physical demands. SEAL training was designed to break people down completely before building them back up. Sarah had to prove she could handle the stress of life-or-death situations, make split-second decisions under pressure, and lead others when everything was falling apart around her. Her first real mission after completing training had been a hostage rescue in Somalia. Intelligence indicated that 3 American aid workers were being held in a compound outside Mogadishu. Sarah was part of a 6-person team tasked with getting them out alive. The mission required infiltrating the compound at night, neutralizing the guards without raising an alarm, and extracting the hostages before enemy reinforcements arrived. She remembered the weight of her gear as they approached the target, the night vision goggles painting everything in eerie green light. Her heart pounded as they cut through the perimeter fence, but her training took over. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled. When they encountered a guard who wasn't where intelligence said he would be, Sarah had to make an instant decision. She neutralized the threat silently, allowing the mission to continue. The extraction had gone perfectly. All 3 hostages were recovered alive, and the team made it back to the extraction point without casualties. Sarah had proven herself under fire, earning the respect of her teammates and superiors. But she also learned that being a SEAL meant constantly adapting to new challenges and unexpected situations. That lesson served her well in subsequent deployments. She had conducted reconnaissance missions in the mountains of Afghanistan, gathered intelligence in Iraqi cities, and participated in direct action raids against high-value targets. Each assignment taught her something new about warfare, leadership, and her own capabilities. But the current assignment was different. Serving in the mess hall required a different kind of vigilance. Instead of watching for enemy movement through rifle scopes, she observed the soldiers who came through the line. She listened to their conversations, noted their morale, and kept an eye out for signs of trouble. A good mess hall operator could learn as much about the base's operational status as any intelligence briefer. The soldiers themselves were a mixed group. Some were veterans on their third or fourth deployment, moving through the line with the weary efficiency of people who had seen too much. Others were fresh-faced kids on their first tour, still excited about being overseas and eager to prove themselves. Sarah made it a point to learn names and remember details about the people she served. In her experience, knowing your people was just as important as knowing your enemy. Private Johnson from Tennessee always asked for extra vegetables because his girlfriend back home was trying to get him to eat healthier. Sergeant Williams from Detroit had 3 kids and carried pictures in his wallet that he would show to anyone willing to look. Corporal Martinez, who shared her last name but no relation, had been a mechanic in civilian life and constantly worried about the vehicles on base not getting proper maintenance. These were the people she was sworn to protect. Not abstract concepts of freedom or democracy, but real individuals with families, dreams, and fears. When she served their meals, she was reminded why the mission mattered. The mess hall itself was a study in military efficiency. Long metal tables arranged in precise rows, industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows, and the constant background noise of generators and air conditioning units fighting against the desert heat. The kitchen behind the serving line was cramped but functional, with massive refrigeration units, commercial-grade stoves, and enough storage space to feed several hundred people multiple times per day. Sarah's station was at the main serving counter, where she could see everyone who entered the facility. It wasn't an accident that she had been assigned to this position. Her training had taught her to assess threats quickly, and the mess hall was one of the few places on base where large numbers of personnel gathered regularly. If someone wanted to cause maximum damage to morale or operational capacity, the dining facility would be a logical target. But today felt like any other day. The morning rush had come and gone, followed by the steady stream of soldiers grabbing late breakfast or early lunch. The afternoon would bring the biggest crowd as people got off duty and came looking for hot food and a few minutes of relaxation. She had just finished serving a group of engineers when she noticed something unusual. A new soldier had entered the mess hall, someone she hadn't seen before. That wasn't particularly strange. People rotated in and out of the base regularly. But something about his demeanor caught her attention. He moved differently than the others, his eyes scanning the room in a pattern that seemed too systematic for a hungry soldier looking for a place to sit. Sarah continued serving food, but kept the newcomer in her peripheral vision. He had gotten a tray and was going through the line, but he wasn't really focused on the food. Instead, he seemed to be studying the layout of the facility, noting the locations of exits and potential cover. His movements were controlled and deliberate, the kind of body language that suggested military training, but not necessarily the same military training as everyone else in the room. Her instincts, honed by years of combat experience, began to sound quiet alarms. There was something wrong with this picture, but she couldn't yet identify exactly what it was. The man looked like a soldier, wore the right uniform, and had apparently passed whatever security screening was required to get onto the base. But every sense she had developed as a SEAL operator was telling her to pay attention. She noticed that he wasn't wearing any unit patches or identifying information beyond basic rank insignia. Again, not necessarily unusual. People sometimes lost or removed patches for various reasons. But combined with his behavior, it added to her growing sense that something wasn't right. The man reached her station in the serving line, and she got her first close look at him. He was average height and build, with dark hair and features that could have been from any number of ethnic backgrounds. His English was accented but fluent, and he made appropriate small talk about the food. Nothing overtly suspicious, but Sarah's trained eye caught details that others might miss. His hands showed calluses in places consistent with weapons training, but the pattern wasn't quite right for standard military firearms. His tan lines suggested he had recently been in a much sunnier climate for extended periods, and There were small scars on his arms that looked like they came from close-quarters combat rather than training accidents. Most telling, however, was the way he carried himself. Despite the casual conversation, his posture and movement suggested someone who was constantly ready for action. It was the kind of hyper-alertness that came from operating in hostile territory, where a moment's inattention could mean death. Sarah served him his meal with a smile and friendly comments about the day's menu, but her mind was racing. She needed more information before she could act on her suspicions, but she also couldn't afford to let a potential threat move freely through the base if her instincts were correct. As the man moved away from the serving line to find a table, Sarah caught the eye of Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the mess hall supervisor. Rodriguez was a career soldier who had seen combat in multiple theaters, and he had learned to trust Sarah's judgment during the months she had been working under his command. She gave him a subtle hand signal that they had developed for situations requiring discretion. 2 fingers tapped against her thigh, followed by a slight nod toward the suspicious individual. Rodriguez understood immediately and began moving into a position where he could observe the situation while appearing to conduct routine supervision. The man selected a table near the center of the dining area, positioning himself where he had good sight lines to all the major entrances and exits. He began eating, but Sarah noticed that he kept checking his watch and glancing toward specific locations around the room. His meal was clearly secondary to whatever else he was doing. Sarah continued serving other soldiers, but kept mental track of the stranger's movements and behavior. She noticed that he wasn't really engaging with other people in the mess hall, despite several attempts by nearby soldiers to start conversations. That was unusual. Military dining facilities were social environments where people naturally interacted, especially when sharing tables. After about 20 minutes, the man finished his meal and began moving toward the exit. Sarah watched as he disposed of his tray and headed for the door, but instead of leaving immediately, he paused to examine the fire exit locations posted near the entrance. Again, this could have been innocent behavior, but combined with everything else she had observed, it strengthened her conviction that something was wrong. As the stranger finally left the mess hall, Sarah made a decision. She needed to follow up on her suspicions, but she had to be careful not to cause unnecessary alarm if she was wrong. The last thing anyone needed was a base-wide security alert triggered by her paranoia. She approached Sergeant Rodriguez during a brief lull in the serving line. "Sarge, I need to step out for a few minutes to check something. Can you cover my station?" Rodriguez nodded. "Everything okay, Martinez?" "Probably nothing, but I want to verify some information. I'll be right back." Sarah removed her serving gloves and apron, then headed toward the exit. She had a pretty good idea where the suspicious individual might have gone, and she wanted to gather more intelligence before deciding whether to alert security. The base layout was burned into her memory from months of living and working there. If someone was conducting reconnaissance for a future operation, they would want to observe key facilities and infrastructure. The mess hall was just one potential target among many. As she stepped outside into the Afghan sun, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of transitioning from routine duty to potential combat operations. Her senses sharpened, her awareness expanded, and the part of her mind trained for warfare began to take control. She had no idea that within the next few hours, everything she had learned as a SEAL would be put to the ultimate test, and that the quiet afternoon in the mess hall was about to become a fight for survival that would reveal exactly why the Navy had really sent her to this particular assignment. Sarah moved through the base with practiced casualness, but every sense was heightened as she tracked the suspicious individual. Her years of SEAL training had taught her how to conduct surveillance without appearing to do so, and she employed those skills now as she followed at a safe distance. The man was making his way toward the vehicle maintenance area, stopping occasionally to observe buildings and defensive positions. To a casual observer, he might have looked like someone getting familiar with a new assignment, but Sarah recognized the systematic approach of someone gathering intelligence for operational planning. She maintained visual contact while staying far enough back to avoid detection. The base was busy with normal afternoon activities, soldiers moving between buildings, vehicles coming and going, the constant background noise of generators and equipment. It provided good cover for both her surveillance and his reconnaissance. As they moved deeper into the compound, Sarah began to piece together a clearer picture of what might be happening. The man's route was taking him past several critical infrastructure points: the communications center, the armory, and the main gate. If someone were planning an attack on the base, these would be logical targets to study. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Could this be a lone wolf scenario? Someone who had somehow infiltrated the base with hostile intentions? Or was he part of a larger operation, gathering information for a future assault? Either way, she needed to gather more evidence before taking action that could alert him to her suspicions. The stranger paused near the motor pool, apparently studying the arrangement of vehicles and security measures. Sarah used a nearby maintenance shed for concealment while she observed his behavior. He was definitely taking mental notes, possibly for later reporting to outside contacts. That's when she noticed the second man. He appeared from behind one of the motor pool buildings, moving with the same controlled awareness as the first individual. The two didn't acknowledge each other directly, but Sarah caught the subtle eye contact that indicated they were working together. Now she was certain this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or paranoid suspicion. The second man was older, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years in harsh environments. Like his companion, he wore appropriate military clothing, but something about him felt wrong. His gear was too clean, his uniform too perfectly maintained for someone who had been deployed for any length of time. Sarah found herself in a difficult position. She had identified what appeared to be a serious security threat, but she was alone and had no immediate way to communicate with base security without potentially compromising her position or alerting the suspects. Her SEAL training had prepared her for operating independently in hostile situations, but this scenario required careful planning. She decided to continue gathering intelligence while looking for an opportunity to safely report what she had discovered. The two men were clearly conducting reconnaissance, but she needed to understand the scope and timing of whatever they were planning before she could formulate an effective response. The first man began moving toward the communications center while his partner headed in the direction of the main gate. They were splitting up to cover more ground, which suggested they were working under time constraints. This could mean that whatever operation they were preparing for was scheduled to happen soon. Sarah made a tactical decision to follow the man heading for the communications center. If they were planning an attack, disrupting base communications would be a logical first step. She needed to see what he was specifically interested in and whether he made contact with anyone inside the facility. Moving through the base required constant awareness of sight lines and potential cover. Sarah used her knowledge of the layout to stay hidden while maintaining visual contact with her target. The afternoon heat created shimmer effects that helped mask movement, and the constant activity of base operations provided ambient noise to cover any sounds she might make. The man approached the communications center with apparent casualness, but Sarah noticed that he positioned himself where he could observe both the main entrance and the security checkpoint. He seemed particularly interested in the guard rotation schedule and the electronic access control systems. As she watched from concealment, Sarah began formulating plans for different scenarios. If this was immediate reconnaissance for an imminent attack, she would need to alert security quickly. If it was longer-term intelligence gathering, she might have time for a more careful approach that could potentially roll up the entire network. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement near her position. The second man had apparently changed course and was now approaching from her left flank. Sarah realized that she might have been detected, or that the two operatives were more sophisticated than she had initially assessed. Training took over as she evaluated her options. She could attempt to evade and continue surveillance, confront one or both individuals directly, or try to reach security with the information she had already gathered. Each choice carried significant risks and potential consequences. The decision was made for her when the second man began moving directly toward her position. He was no longer conducting casual reconnaissance. His movement pattern indicated he was actively hunting for something, possibly her. Sarah had to assume her surveillance had been compromised. She shifted position to maintain concealment while preparing for potential confrontation. Her SEAL training included extensive close-quarters combat instruction, but she was operating alone against an unknown number of hostiles in an environment filled with friendly personnel. Any action she took had to be precise and calculated to avoid causing harm to innocent people. The man searching for her was getting closer, and Sarah realized she was running out of options for remaining hidden. The area around the communications center didn't offer unlimited concealment, and she couldn't retreat without potentially losing contact with both suspects. That's when the first explosion shattered the afternoon quiet. The blast came from the direction of the main gate, a thunderous roar that shook buildings and sent debris flying through the air. Immediately, alarms began sounding across the base as personnel responded to what was obviously an attack. Sarah's mind instantly shifted from surveillance to combat mode. The reconnaissance she had been observing was apparently the final preparation for an assault that was now beginning. The two men she had been tracking were part of an inside element designed to support an external attack. The man who had been hunting for her forgot about stealth as he reached for a concealed radio to coordinate with the attacking force. Sarah had a split second to decide whether to engage him immediately or try to reach other defenders who might not yet understand the full scope of what was happening. She chose action. Moving with the speed and precision that had made her a successful SEAL operator, Sarah closed the distance to her target before he could complete his radio transmission. Her attack was swift and silent, a chokehold that rendered him unconscious within seconds while preventing him from alerting his Confederates to her presence. As the man collapsed, Sarah quickly searched him for weapons and intelligence. She found a pistol, several spare magazines, and a radio set to frequencies that weren't used by base security. Most importantly, she discovered a detailed map of the base with specific targets marked and attack routes highlighted. The intelligence painted a clear picture of the threat they were facing. This wasn't a simple raid or random attack. It was a carefully planned assault designed to neutralize the base's defensive capabilities while inflicting maximum casualties on personnel. The mess hall, where she had been working just minutes before, was marked as a primary target. Sarah realized that her assignment to the dining facility hadn't been random after all. Someone in intelligence had suspected this threat might materialize, and they had positioned her where she could observe and respond to exactly this type of inside reconnaissance. Her SEAL training and combat experience made her the ideal person to detect and counter infiltration attempts. With the first part of the enemy plan disrupted, Sarah needed to locate the second infiltrator and determine how many other inside elements might be operating on the base. The attack was clearly underway, but she might still be able to prevent the most devastating parts of the plan from succeeding. The sounds of combat were intensifying near the main gate, with automatic weapons fire and additional explosions indicating a serious assault in progress. Base defenders would be focused on repelling the external attack, which meant the internal threats might have freedom of movement to accomplish their objectives. Sarah secured the unconscious infiltrator's weapons and equipment, then began moving toward the last known position of his partner. The communications center was a critical target that had to be protected, but she also needed to consider the possibility that there were other inside operators she hadn't yet identified. As she moved through the base, she could see the confusion and controlled chaos that always accompanied the beginning of an unexpected attack. Soldiers were running toward defensive positions, officers were trying to coordinate responses, and support personnel were securing sensitive areas according to established protocols. But Sarah knew that protocols designed for external attacks might not be adequate for dealing with infiltrators who understood the base layout and defensive measures. The enemy had clearly studied their target extensively and planned their assault to exploit specific vulnerabilities. She reached the communications center to find that the second infiltrator was no longer in the area. Either he had moved to another target or he had already accomplished whatever mission he had been assigned there. Sarah needed to think like the enemy planners to anticipate where he might strike next. The marked map she had taken from the first infiltrator showed several priority targets beyond the communications center. The armory was highlighted, as was the base commander's headquarters and the helicopter landing zone. If she were planning this attack, she would want to prevent reinforcements from arriving while simultaneously disrupting command and control. That realization sent a chill through her as she understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just an attack on their base. It was designed to eliminate a key installation in the region and potentially affect ongoing operations throughout the theater. Sarah made a rapid assessment of her priorities. The external attack was being handled by the base's defensive forces, but the internal threats were her responsibility. She had unique knowledge of what the enemy was planning, and she was probably the only person on the base who fully understood the scope of the infiltration. She needed to reach the command center to alert leadership about the inside threat, while simultaneously hunting down the remaining infiltrator before he could accomplish his mission. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-pressure situation that SEAL training had prepared her for, but she had never expected to face it while assigned to mess hall duty. As she began moving toward the command center, Sarah reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Just an hour ago, she had been serving lunch to soldiers and worrying about whether they were getting proper nutrition. Now she was engaged in a life-or-death struggle to prevent a devastating attack on the entire base. The irony wasn't lost on her that her cover assignment had actually been the perfect position for detecting this threat. By serving food to everyone on the base, she had been able to observe behavior patterns and identify anomalies that might have gone unnoticed in other positions. Her SEAL training had taught her that the most effective operations often succeeded because of careful observation and attention to detail rather than dramatic action. But now it was time for dramatic action. The base was under assault. Infiltrators were operating inside the perimeter, and she was the only person who understood the full scope of the threat they were facing. Everything she had learned during the most challenging military training in the world was about to be put to the ultimate test. As another explosion rocked the base, Sarah Martinez, who had been serving Chow in the mess hall just an hour before, prepared to prove why the Navy SEALs were considered among the most elite warriors in the world. Sarah moved through the chaos with lethal purpose, her mind calculating angles and possibilities with the precision of a computer. The base was under full assault now, with explosions echoing from multiple directions and the distinctive crack of rifle fire mixing with the deeper rumble of heavy weapons. Through it all, she maintained focus on her primary mission, stopping the infiltrators before they could complete their objectives. The command center was 3 buildings away, but getting there safely required navigating through an increasingly dangerous environment. The external attackers had clearly studied the base's defensive positions and were targeting specific vulnerabilities with coordinated fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from elevated positions outside the perimeter, indicating that the enemy had established overwatch positions before beginning their assault. She reached the edge of an open courtyard that she would need to cross to reach the command center. The space was roughly 50 meters of exposed ground with minimal cover, exactly the kind of killing field that competent attackers would have under observation. Sarah studied the area for several seconds, noting potential cover positions and escape routes before committing to movement. As she prepared to cross the courtyard, movement caught her eye near the armory building. The second infiltrator had emerged from concealment and was approaching the weapons storage facility with a large backpack that definitely hadn't been part of his equipment when she first spotted him. The implications were immediately clear. He was planning to destroy the armory, eliminating the base's ammunition supplies, and potentially causing a massive secondary explosion. Sarah faced a critical decision. She could continue toward the command center to alert leadership about the infiltration, or she could engage the immediate threat to the armory. The armory explosion would likely kill dozens of people and cripple the base's ability to defend itself, but without command authority coordinating the response, other infiltrators might accomplish their missions unopposed. Training and instinct made the choice for her. The immediate threat to the armory took priority, and she was in the best position to stop it. Sarah altered her route and began moving toward the weapons facility, using every scrap of cover available while keeping the infiltrator under observation. The man was working with obvious familiarity with explosive devices, removing components from his backpack and assembling what appeared to be a sophisticated demolition charge. His positioning indicated he understood exactly where to place the explosives for maximum effect, suggesting extensive intelligence preparation and possibly inside knowledge of the facility's construction. Sarah was 50 meters away when she realized she wasn't going to reach him before he completed his preparations. The infiltrator was already attaching the final components to his device, and she could see him checking what appeared to be a timer mechanism. She had perhaps 60 seconds before the armory disappeared in a massive fireball that would devastate the entire base. Without hesitation, Sarah raised the pistol she had taken from the first infiltrator and lined up her shot. The range was at the outer limit of practical accuracy for a handgun, especially under combat conditions, but she had qualified expert with multiple weapon systems during her SEAL training. More importantly, she had learned to make impossible shots under pressure when lives depended on her marksmanship. The infiltrator was focused on his demolition work, presenting a relatively stable target as he bent over the explosive device. Sarah controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. The 9mm round struck the man in the upper chest, spinning him away from the demolition charge and sending him crashing into the armory wall. The shot had been perfect, incapacitating the threat while avoiding the explosive device that could still detonate if damaged by gunfire. Sarah immediately moved toward the armory to secure the explosives and verify that the infiltrator was neutralized. As she approached, she could see that her shot had been fatal, but she also noticed that the timer on the demolition device was still counting down. The infiltrator had apparently activated the mechanism before she could stop him. Explosive ordnance disposal had been part of her SEAL training, but Sarah had never considered herself an expert in the field. However, she was the only person available to deal with a sophisticated explosive device that would detonate in approximately 30 seconds. The irony of surviving years of combat operations only to be killed by a bomb while serving mess hall duty was not lost on her. She approached the device carefully, studying its construction and trying to identify the type of timer and detonation system. It appeared to be a commercially manufactured timing device connected to what looked like several pounds of military-grade plastic explosive. The sophistication of the setup suggested professional training and access to high-quality materials. 20 seconds remaining on the timer. Sarah could see 3 different wire assemblies leading from the timer to various components of the explosive charge. Standard procedure would be to identify the primary detonation circuit and disable it, but cutting the wrong wire could trigger an anti-tampering mechanism that would cause immediate detonation. 15 seconds. She traced the wire paths with her eyes, trying to determine which circuit was the actual trigger mechanism and which might be decoys or booby traps. The device was more sophisticated than anything she had encountered during training, suggesting that the enemy had access to advanced explosive technology. 10 seconds. Sarah made her decision. Instead of trying to disarm a device she didn't fully understand, she grabbed the entire assembly and sprinted toward the open courtyard she had been preparing to cross earlier. If the explosives were going to detonate, better to have them explode in an open area away from buildings and personnel. 5 seconds. She was halfway across the courtyard when the device exploded in her hands. The blast picked her up and hurled her through the air, the concussion wave stunning her senses and filling her vision with white light. She hit the ground hard, rolling several times before coming to rest against a concrete barrier that probably saved her life by providing cover from debris and secondary blast effects. For several seconds, Sarah lay motionless, trying to assess her condition and determine whether she was still alive. Her ears were ringing, her vision was blurred, and every part of her body ached from the explosion and impact. But as her senses slowly returned, she realized that her gamble had paid off. The explosive device had detonated in an open area where it caused minimal damage to critical infrastructure. More importantly, she was still functional enough to continue the mission. Sarah struggled to her feet, fighting through the disorientation and pain. The explosion had definitely injured her. She could feel blood running down her face, and her left arm wasn't responding properly, but she was mobile and still armed with weapons taken from the first infiltrator. The sounds of battle continued around her, indicating that the external attack was still in progress. She could see soldiers in defensive positions returning fire against the attackers outside the perimeter, but the coordination seemed better now than it had been when the assault first began. The base's defenders were adapting to the threat and beginning to mount an effective response. But Sarah's mission wasn't finished. She had neutralized 2 infiltrators and prevented the destruction of the armory, but The marked map had shown multiple targets. There could be other inside threats still operating, and she was the only person who understood the full scope of the enemy's plan. She needed to reach the command center to brief leadership on what she had discovered and ensure that security teams were searching for additional infiltrators. The information she had gathered was too important to risk losing if she was killed or incapacitated before she could pass it along. As she began moving toward the command center again, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mess hall where she had been working was now engulfed in flames, apparently struck by rocket or mortar fire during the attack. If she had still been at her post serving food when the assault began, she would almost certainly be dead. The realization hit her that her decision to follow the suspicious individual had probably saved her life, in addition to allowing her to disrupt the infiltration plan. The enemy had indeed targeted the dining facility, just as their map had indicated. Her survival was due to her SEAL training and the instincts that had told her something was wrong. Movement near the burning mess hall caught her attention. Another figure was emerging from the smoke, wearing the uniform of a base maintenance worker, but moving with the same controlled awareness she had noticed in the other infiltrators. This had to be a third inside operator, one who hadn't been accounted for in her earlier observations. Sarah realized that the infiltration was even more extensive than she had initially understood. The enemy had positioned multiple assets throughout the base, probably over a period of weeks or months, building up the capability for a coordinated assault that would neutralize defensive capabilities while inflicting maximum casualties. The third infiltrator was carrying what appeared to be a portable radio jamming device, explaining why communications had seemed disrupted since the attack began. He was moving toward the communications center, probably to ensure that the jamming equipment was positioned for maximum effectiveness against the base's radio networks. Sarah understood that she was facing a decision that would define the outcome of the entire battle. She could continue toward the command center with the intelligence she had already gathered, or she could engage this new threat and risk everything on stopping one more piece of the enemy's plan. But as she watched the infiltrator moving toward the communications center, she realized that stopping the jamming equipment might be the key to turning the entire battle around. If the base's defenders could restore full communications, they could coordinate a much more effective response to the external attack. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition and began moving to intercept the third infiltrator. Her left arm was still not fully functional from the explosion, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade from blood loss and shock. But she was still a Navy SEAL, and she had a mission to complete. The infiltrator was almost at the communications center when Sarah reached a position where she could engage him effectively. Unlike the previous encounters, this one would be a direct confrontation with an alert enemy who was expecting resistance. The element of surprise was gone, and she would have to rely on superior training and determination to prevail. As she prepared for what could be her final engagement, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. From serving food in a mess hall to engaging in mortal combat with infiltrators seemed like an impossible transition, but her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this kind of rapid escalation from routine duty to life-or-death action. The third infiltrator reached the communications center and began setting up his jamming equipment. Sarah could see that he was working quickly but carefully, suggesting that he understood the importance of his mission to the overall attack plan. If he succeeded in completely shutting down the base's communications, the external assault would have a much better chance of success. Sarah moved into position for her final engagement, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes of combat. The battle for the base would be won or lost based on whether she could stop this last infiltrator and restore the defenders' ability to coordinate their response. As she prepared to engage, Sarah thought about all the soldiers she had served food to over the past months, their faces, their stories, their families back home. This was why she had become a SEAL, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves and to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. The infiltrator finished setting up his equipment and reached for the activation switch. Sarah knew she was out of time. Sarah moved like a shadow through the smoke and chaos, her SEAL training taking complete control as she closed the distance to the third infiltrator. The man was focused on his jamming equipment, His back turned to her approach as he made final adjustments to the device that would cripple the base's communications. She was 10 meters away when he sensed her presence and began to turn. The moment seemed to stretch as their eyes met, his widening in surprise and alarm, hers cold and focused with lethal intent. He reached for a weapon at his belt, but Sarah was already moving with the fluid precision of countless hours of close-quarters combat training. Her attack was swift and devastating. Years of hand-to-hand combat instruction compressed into 3 seconds of violent action that left the infiltrator unconscious on the ground beside his jamming equipment. Sarah quickly secured his weapons and disabled the device that would have isolated the base from outside communications. With the jamming threat neutralized, she could hear radio chatter beginning to resume as the communications center personnel restored contact with defensive positions around the perimeter. The coordination she could hear in the radio traffic told her that the base's defenders were finally getting organized to mount an effective counterattack. But Sarah's mission was far from over. The marked map she had taken from the first infiltrator showed one more critical target, the helicopter landing zone where medical evacuation flights and supply missions originated. If there was another infiltrator position there, he could prevent wounded personnel from being evacuated or reinforcements from arriving. She gathered the enemy radio equipment and began monitoring their communications to better understand what remained of their assault plan. What she heard confirmed her worst fears. The attack was even more sophisticated than she had realized, with multiple phases designed to systematically destroy the base's defensive capabilities. The external assault was apparently the preliminary phase, designed to focus attention on the perimeter while infiltrators neutralized critical infrastructure from within. The plan called for a second wave of attackers to exploit the chaos and confusion to penetrate the base's inner defenses. Sarah realized she was listening to a textbook example of modern asymmetric warfare, a coordinated attack that combined conventional assault tactics with infiltration and sabotage. The enemy had studied their target extensively and developed a plan that exploited every weakness in the base's security. But they had made one critical error in their planning. They had assumed that all personnel assigned to support roles were non-combatants who would be ineffective in a crisis situation. They had not anticipated that a Navy SEAL might be serving food in the mess hall, observing their reconnaissance activities, and preparing to disrupt their entire operation. The radio chatter indicated that the second wave of attackers was already moving toward the base perimeter, expecting to find defenses in disarray and critical systems disabled. Instead, they would encounter coordinated resistance from defenders who had maintained their communications and were now aware of the infiltration threat. Sarah needed to reach the helicopter landing zone to check for additional infiltrators, but she also wanted to provide intelligence about the incoming second wave to the base defenders. The information she had gathered could be crucial for positioning defensive forces to maximum advantage. She made her way toward the command center, moving carefully through an environment that was still dangerous despite the improving tactical situation. The external attackers were maintaining pressure on the perimeter defenses, and random mortar rounds continued to impact throughout the base. As she approached the command center, Sarah could see the controlled urgency of a military headquarters responding to crisis. Officers were coordinating defensive positions, communications personnel were managing radio networks, and intelligence staff were trying to assess the scope and intentions of the attacking force. Sarah presented herself to the senior watch officer and quickly briefed him on what she had discovered. The revelation that the attack included infiltrators operating from within the base caused immediate changes in defensive planning, with security teams being dispatched to search for additional inside threats. More importantly, her intelligence about the second wave of attackers allowed the defenders to prepare positions and coordinate fires to maximum advantage. Instead of facing confused and disorganized resistance, the incoming assault force would encounter a carefully prepared defense that was expecting their attack. The base commander, Colonel James Mitchell, arrived at the command center as Sarah was completing her briefing. He listened intently as she described the infiltration operation and the intelligence she had gathered from the captured materials. "Martinez," he said when she finished, "I need to ask you something that might sound strange. What exactly is your assignment on this base?" Sarah straightened despite her injuries and exhaustion. Mess hall duty, sir. I've been serving in the dining facility for the past 3 months. Colonel Mitchell studied her for a long moment, taking in her combat-worn appearance and the weapons she had captured from the infiltrators. And your background before this assignment? Navy SEAL, sir. I completed BUD/S 3 years ago and have conducted multiple deployments in support of special operations. The colonel nodded slowly, and Sarah could see understanding dawn in his eyes. I think I'm beginning to understand why certain people in intelligence thought you might be well suited for mess hall duty at this particular base. Sarah realized that her assignment had indeed been carefully planned by people who understood threats that she had been too focused on routine duties to fully appreciate. Someone had suspected that this base might be targeted for infiltration and had positioned her where she could observe and respond to exactly the kind of reconnaissance activities she had detected. Sir, she said, there's still one more potential target that needs to be checked. The helicopter landing zone was marked on their operational map, and we haven't verified whether there are additional infiltrators positioned there. Colonel Mitchell looked at her injuries and exhaustion, clearly considering whether to send her on another mission or assign the task to other personnel. Martinez, you've already done more than anyone could have expected. We can send a security team to check the landing zone. Respectfully, sir, I have the most current intelligence about their operational methods, and I can recognize the behavioral patterns we should be looking for. Time might be critical if they're planning to prevent medical evacuation or disrupt reinforcement flights. The colonel considered for a moment, then nodded. Take a security team with you, but you're the lead on this. Your experience today has proven that you understand this threat better than anyone else on the base. Sarah gathered a 4-person security team and headed for the helicopter landing zone, briefing them on what to look for as they moved through the base. The sounds of combat were beginning to diminish as the defensive forces gained control of the tactical situation, but she knew that the mission wasn't complete until all infiltrators had been neutralized. The landing zone was located near the southern edge of the base, positioned to allow helicopters to approach and depart without overflying populated areas. It was also relatively isolated from other facilities, making it an ideal location for an infiltrator to position himself without being easily observed. As they approached the area, Sarah used hand signals to position her team for optimal observation and fields of fire. Her SEAL training had included extensive instruction in small unit tactics, and she applied those principles now to ensure they could detect and engage any threats while maintaining security for their own personnel. They found the 4th infiltrator exactly where Sarah had expected, in a concealed position overlooking the landing zone with a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile system. He was clearly waiting for a medical evacuation helicopter or supply flight to present an easy target for his weapon. The implications were chilling. If the infiltrator had succeeded in shooting down a medical helicopter, it would have eliminated the base's casualty evacuation capability while potentially killing wounded soldiers and medical personnel. The psychological impact alone could have been devastating to morale and operational effectiveness. Sarah coordinated with her security team to surround the infiltrator's position without alerting him to their presence. Unlike her previous engagements, this situation allowed for careful planning and coordination rather than immediate action under fire. They moved into position with textbook precision, establishing overlapping fields of fire and coordinating their approach to ensure the threat could be neutralized without risking the missile system being fired. Sarah's role was to serve as the primary takedown while her team provided security and backup. The infiltrator was so focused on his assigned target area that he never detected their approach. Sarah's training allowed her to close to contact range and neutralize the threat without him having opportunity to employ his weapon or alert other enemy forces to the security breach. With the 4th infiltrator captured and his missile system secured, Sarah and her team conducted a thorough search of the landing zone area to ensure there were no additional threats or hidden equipment. The search revealed evidence that the infiltrator had been in position for several hours, confirming that the attack had been planned well in advance with detailed coordination between inside and outside elements. As they completed their security sweep, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching the base, the first medical evacuation flight since the attack began. The aircraft would be able to land safely and evacuate wounded personnel because the missile threat had been eliminated before it could be employed. The sight of the helicopter landing safely brought home the full significance of what she had accomplished. By detecting the initial reconnaissance and disrupting the infiltration operation, she had prevented massive casualties and preserved the base's operational capabilities in the face of a sophisticated enemy assault. Colonel Mitchell met them as they returned to the command center with the captured infiltrator and missile system. The tactical situation had stabilized completely, with the external attackers either eliminated or driven off by the coordinated defensive response. Martinez, the colonel said, "I've been in communication with higher headquarters about today's events. It seems that your assignment to this base was part of a larger counterintelligence operation designed to identify and disrupt infiltration networks in the region." Sarah listened as he explained that intelligence services had detected patterns suggesting that enemy forces were conducting systematic reconnaissance of coalition bases, possibly in preparation for coordinated attacks designed to degrade military capabilities throughout the theater. Your cover assignment allowed you to observe personnel movement patterns and identify anomalies that might indicate hostile reconnaissance. The fact that you were also qualified to respond effectively when the threat materialized was considered an additional benefit, but not the primary mission. Sarah realized that she had unknowingly been conducting a counterintelligence operation while she thought she was simply serving food to hungry soldiers. Her SEAL training and combat experience had been the perfect background for detecting threats that less experienced personnel might have missed. More importantly, her months of serving in the mess hall had allowed her to establish relationships and gather information that proved crucial when crisis struck. By knowing the personnel and understanding the base's operational patterns, she had been able to quickly identify what was abnormal and respond accordingly. As medical personnel treated her injuries, and she began the process of documenting everything she had observed and accomplished, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had led from serving Chow in a mess hall to conducting a solo counterinfiltration operation that saved dozens of lives. She thought about all the soldiers she had served over the past months. Private Johnson, who worried about eating vegetables, Sergeant Williams with his pictures of his children, Corporal Martinez who fretted about vehicle maintenance. They were all safe because she had been in the right place at the right time with the right training to recognize and respond to a deadly threat. The mission had proven that every assignment in the military had significance, and that the most routine duties could suddenly become matters of life and death. Her SEAL Trident had been hidden under a mess hall apron, but when the moment came, it had made all the difference between victory and disaster. As she completed her final reports and prepared for medical evacuation to a larger facility for treatment of her injuries, Sarah Martinez knew that she had fulfilled the most important mission of her career while wearing the least likely uniform. She had been serving Chow in the mess hall until the enemy struck and discovered exactly why the Navy SEALs were among the most elite warriors in the world.